This is Troy McGuinness, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Troy Lightfoot, and with me I have my co-host, Colleen Johnson.
Hey, Troy.
Hello, and Jay Hrcsko.
Hello.
Hopefully I said that right.
Doesn't really matter. Nobody does.
I've only known you 3 years now or something. Or
Whatever.
I'm still guessing. Yes, so today we are going to be talking about flow at all levels in an organization, and particularly when it comes to my kind of theory about how lean thinking is really kind of I'm not going to say it's totally missing in the Agile community because obviously it's present, but I don't see a huge emphasis on it as compared to things like Scrum Mastery and these types of things. So I believe that lean thinking is really what's needed to kind of unlock the Agile principles. And maybe we can dive into that and how each one of them helps to actually improve on the efficacy of the Agile principles. So flow at all levels of an organization and probabilistic forecasting. So I just had a little quick conversation with our old pal Ryan Lockard on Twitter about velocity being metric. And I was shocked to see that he said it is a metric, it's just not a good one. So so we got a little talk about that, and I started getting into probabilistic forecasting, and I said, you know what, I'm going to save this for the podcast. So, okay. So I think maybe we should kick it off with, let's just define, what do we mean when we say flow? For example, the definition of the word maybe, and a brief history of where it comes from in lean. And I'm actually going to defer to Colleen for this one, if you don't mind.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank God you didn't pick me.
So, I mean, I think when I think of lean, I go back to Toyota production systems and kind of the origin of TPS when we talk about lean thinking, with the goal being the elimination of waste, and the three different types of waste. And, there were other elements that were part of the Toyota way or Toyota production systems, like Kaizen, respect for people. So there's a lot of core elements when you dig into the Toyota philosophies that are major pieces of Agile, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, none of it's really new. It's just rebranded for
Right.
a new sales channel.
Right.
But when I think about, I guess, what I would define flow as, it's the ability to change direction easily and respond to unplanned events.
Mm-hmm.
And then I always picture kind of a circle when I think of flow, and that part of that adaptability is always responding to feedback. And so it's this constant loop of quickly getting feedback, digesting it, and doing something different with what you've learned. And that's, to me, that's what I think of when I think of flow. And I think you can probably apply that to all different levels of the organization, like what we're going to be talking about here.
Okay.
But I do. Did that fit what you were looking for?
Oh yeah, that was a good one. Good explanation. And just for those for the uninitiated, Colleen is a certified Kanban trainer, so I had to defer for that answer. Yes. But yes. So that's an awesome answer. So I know for the folks who are listening, we kind of a little behind the curtain. We usually have agendas for these things. And I'm actually going to add in one thing here on the fly, and maybe be emergent with it a little bit, if you guys don't mind, my co-hosts, before we get to point 2. And I was thinking about this during the week before, obviously before we recorded this, and I was thinking about, in the context of Agile, how does flow and lean thinking fit in? And maybe we can just have a quick conversation around this, if you guys don't mind.
Well, Yeah, I think you kind of touched on something interesting at the very beginning here, Troy, and that is it missing? You know, is there some lean thinking that's missing entirely from Agile? And I would say absolutely it is. I think We were kind of joking before we started recording just about the pressure to predict what you're going to deliver and when and come up with this plan. And even though we say we're trying to be agile and fluid and responsive, we still are in the agile world very plan based and plan driven, and trying to predict what's going to happen 2 weeks and 3 months or even a year down the road, which in a lot of ways to me is not flow and isn't very lean. We're stripping away our ability to respond to feedback and respond to what's actually happening, and often to the detriment of the business at that point. If you're trying to forecast out what you're going to deliver in 6 months, who knows if that's even relevant anymore by the time you get to that.
Right. So maybe we can do something fun. And now I'm really like, I don't know. I'm hopped up on that keto chocolate mousse. So I'm just like, I don't know. I got yeah. Okay. So maybe we can just kind of go around a little round table, and I'm going to surprise you guys. Now I'm really feeling adventurous here. All right. So I'm going to say an agile principle. Okay. And maybe if I say your name, think about how lean thinking and flow would tie back to this somehow. Okay, maybe this should, and we can always edit this out if it's terrible, so don't worry. Okay, so all right, so,
lean thinking roulette.
All right, so yes, exactly. So I'm gonna go first. I'll be the volunteer. Okay, so our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. So for those who aren't aware, that is Agile principle number 1 in the manifesto. So when I see that early and continuous delivery of valuable software, so what jumps out to me in regards to lean thinking is continuous delivery. In order to deliver continuously, you have to be in a state of flow and not deliver in batches. Early, so it's not, again, doing big bang releases. It's not about speed. It's about soon or when. For instance, it's not about how fast we can do things per se, but it's about how soon we can do it, if that makes sense. And last one is valuable. So the idea of always thinking about getting rid of waste and always trying to build the right thing. And we're going to talk a little bit about lean thinking at a portfolio level, and this definitely goes with that.
See, when you said early, the first thing that jumped in my mind, Troy, small batch size, right? Because you can't do, like you said, you can't do large chunks of work quickly. You can't do them at speed. You can't deliver value quickly if you have this giant piece of work. And that's, I think, one of the core, we started talking about, how is lean misconstrued in the enterprise, and how is lean not really part of agile in certain aspects. I think that we get away from the basics, and it's not that we do it on purpose. I think it's because there is such an emphasis placed on the Scrum piece of agile delivery. Mm-hmm. I won't go as far as to say Scrum is eating the world, but I think there's so much emphasis put on that, and there's almost a ignorance to Kanban and to an extent lean and all those pieces. Not out of we were talking about before. It's not out of malice. It's not even out of stupidity. It's just an ignorance, and I think because of that, that's where it's missing. The whole idea of small batch sizes and consistent predictability, and just when you said flow. And the first thing that comes to mind, Colleen gave all the Kaizen examples. My brain works really stupid. When I think of flow, what the first thing that pops in my mind? That I Love Lucy skit where the chocolates are coming down the assembly line. That's what I think of flow, because it's only going in one direction. It's a constant pace and it's a constant speed. And actually, if you play that skit out to its hysterical conclusion, it's what happens when companies try to do too much too fast, when your batch sizes aren't universal, right? Everything gets all screwed up, and I'm jamming chocolates in my mouth, which, wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing or objectionable. But that's, I think, where I know I went on a bit of a rant there, but that's where I think batch size. As soon as I think flow, I think batch size. Get it small, get it predictable, get it out the door. And we lose that all the time.
All right. So I got go ahead.
It's kind of, I would say it's even, it's a false sense of comfort or a false sense of security that we put so much value in these plans, right? The plans are out of date the minute we write them, and they should be. And I think it's such a long road to get an organization to the point where they value that responsiveness over that planning. And I think it's one of the questions I run into a lot, just working with different organizations, of how do you get them to the point where they feel more comfortable having the flexibility to change direction tomorrow versus feeling more comfortable having a 6-month roadmap of individual features they're going to deliver.
To answer that question, Colleen, how do you answer that? Because my answer, I'll be honest, my answer is we have to prove as an organization, as a delivery team, a delivery organization, a vertical, whatever, we have to prove through our success, through consistently delivering value at speed and being able to change, that we are getting reliable enough and predictable enough that you don't have to worry about, they won't worry about their plans anymore, the business, right? Gratuitous air quotes here. They don't worry about the plan because we're consistently delivering value. So then they can really concentrate on the value, not the date you told them, which is arbitrary and may change.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the other part of it is visibility, right? Which is a core piece of implementing Kanban at any of these levels we're talking about. But I think there's always just such an interesting kind of, oh shit moment when all of the work that you've planned is now visible for the whole organization to see. You start getting, I think, people who are looking at that board going, that's not important anymore, that's not relevant anymore, or we're about to lose this customer. Don't spend any more engineering resources on that thing we picked 3 months ago. So I think part of it is visibility, so that you can elevate the conversation and have just more information at your disposal to start, to be more fluid in picking what you're going to work on next. I think that you have to have that. Otherwise, everybody's going to be asking you for a plan because they can't see what's happening.
Okay, so in lieu of going through every principle, I'll just pick like 2 more and we can keep.
Okay.
So I'm going to chime in about this one, and then we're going to go to the roulette. So the second one is welcome changing requirements even late in development. Agile processes harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. So for those who aren't familiar, I believe when they say the customer, they are talking about companies that they are working at, because most of them were consultants, if not all of them, I think, at the time. So when they say customer, they're really talking about the companies that can harness these agile processes, right? So my thought about this in relation to lean and flow is that you cannot welcome change in requirements if you don't have Slack in the system. Mm-hmm. So you have to leave Slack. And that's one thing. And the second thing is you can't welcome change in requirements if your quality is crap. So, and if the quality of the code is not modular and it's not easy to change, then you won't welcome change in requirements, right? So it goes from the lean side of things about building in quality and leaving Slack. That's what kind of jumps out to me with that principle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the parts that's always, and again, a challenge with the concept of Slack, when you think about engineering resources, they're not cheap resources, right? And so for us to go into a new team that's trying to adopt more lean principles and say, we don't want everybody fully utilized, you're probably going to raise some eyebrows, because everybody's like, well, then, how much money are we leaving on the floor with people just sitting there checking out Reddit? And I think another thing around, kind of going back to that same concept of visualizing as much as possible, I like to start by tracking planned versus unplanned work. And that's something you can do if you're still running Scrum, right? Track what comes up in the sprint that's not planned work, or what gets abandoned that was planned work. So you can start to have a conversation about how much Slack do you even need in your system. I don't think I've ever worked with a team that had 0 unplanned work things that came up day to day or week to week. So I think that's being able to measure that and show that to the team starts to give you the basis for the conversation about why Slack's going to be so important for them.
Right. And go ahead, Jay.
I think that, I'm going to give an odd example of Slack in the system. I work in a large company, very meeting heavy, right? So on a given day, there are some days where in an 8-hour workday, I have 6.5, 7 hours of meetings, right? Which is totally insane. I made the point in a conversation the other day with my boss on a team where I said, we talk about focus factor for teams where you should only, accommodate 70% of your time typically and leave some space to absorb unplanned work. I said, think about our calendars. When we have an 8-hour workday and 7 hours of meeting, how much space are we actually giving ourselves to absorb Colleen, the executive, who comes out of nowhere and says, hey, can I steal a half hour of your time because I'm working on something and I really need your expertise? Or Troy, you and I go into something and we realize that it's bigger than a bread box, so we blow off the next meeting we had because we're going to try and sort it out because we got the juices flowing. So perfect example of Slack in a system without even talking about delivery. It's how much space, like you said, Colleen, how much space do you give yourself to absorb that unplanned work? Which, by the way, I got to give a shout out to the episode you did with Dominica DeGrandis. I actually have been waving that book around in my stand-ups to the camera.
It's so good.
Telling everybody, read this book. You need to understand this. You know, when we wonder why it takes us so long to get things done, it's because, like you said, we have no Slack in the system. We don't visualize the work. We ignore the unplanned work. All those things. It really is. It seems almost like common sensey, but it isn't.
Yeah. You know, it's crazy. It does seem like just very basic stuff. And I feel like when we go in and start the process of visualizing everything and tracking everything, sometimes I feel like, I can't believe I get paid for this shit. But then when you see the impact it has on a team and the conversations you start to have and, you know, that shift in thinking to valuing some of the stuff we're talking about here, I feel like the Marie Kondo of software teams here and helping them organize
This
all
does
of
not
their
bring me
crap.
joy. This does not bring me joy. Get rid of it. Thank you. Get rid of it.
Exactly. You don't need that planning meeting. Toss it out.
I may try that tomorrow and see if that works. So I'm either going to have to promote it or in the unemployment line. So if your phone rings, you know what happened.
So, okay. So maybe we can move on to the next agenda item. And that is, why is flow important for an organization? And what does it look like at all levels? So there's kind of a new buzzword. I think it's kind of a buzzword going around, and it's gaining a lot of popularity, and that is called business agility. So in the context of business agility, maybe we can talk about why is flow important for an entire business to be agile, not just a software development team.
So I'll go first, Colleen, if you don't mind. Whenever I think of business agility, I think it was Ward Cunningham. It was in the introduction to Jeff Patton's user story mapping.
Right.
Where he actually says, I think, and I'm going to butcher this quote. We'll correct it in the show notes. I think his quote was, I have it on a post-it at my desk. Business agility is defined as an organization that can react to both opportunities and threats uniquely and in the moment. That's the way, and I thought that was summed perfectly, because if you think about all this crap, right, for lack of a better term, that we preach about being able to absorb change, having Slack in the system, being able to pivot and deliver value continuously, that's really what it comes down to, being nimble, right? Not even agile. I hate to use a synonym, but it's nimble. So when I think of flow and business agility, it's the ability to absorb, like we said, an opportunity comes up, right? So, okay, well, we have this opportunity. Somebody just bowed out of the market. What do? Credit card company X has gone under, and we work at credit card company Y. So what offerings can we create? You know, what type of programs can we create to suck some people in? So it's really having the Slack in the system, having the visualization to know what's out there, and then being able to absorb that with minor uncomfortability.
Good answer. That was good.
I apparently know more about this than I thought I did. Wow, actually impressing myself.
Colleen, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think Jay's answer was great. You know, I think that when we talk about business agility, I think one of the things that we're often missing is not just the responsiveness to customer needs and the ability to change direction as markets change and competition changes, which is super important. I mean, you'll go out of business if you can't do those things well. But I think the other part that we're often missing is the ability to inspect our practices as an organization and change those. And I mean, back to what you said at the beginning about, you know, what's missing from Agile, what lean principles are missing from Agile. I mean, I think even just Agile itself has become something that you put into place and never really change. And I think part of business agility is in looking at your practices as an organization and saying, this isn't fitting us, you know, maybe doing a release train every 12 weeks doesn't make sense for our organization anymore. So let's change it to something that does. I think from a business perspective, we get really stuck in doing something kind of prescriptive and expecting it to improve because we're doing it the same way over and over, rather than looking to what things we can tweak and make improvements to from that Kaizen perspective and make it really fit our business needs.
Right.
So I'm going to ask both of you a question. So, and this is a callback to Colleen. I think it was the interview you did with David Anderson about the Kanban maturity model, where he talked about the difference between Western and Eastern organizations when it comes to continuous improvement. And I think it was David who made the remark that, I think it was this episode, where he remarked that Western organizations want to continuously improve until an organization is fit for purpose. And then they want to basically put a bow on it and move on. Whereas, the Kaizen and Toyota, production system, Eastern organizations, Eastern cultures want to legitimately continuously improve, lower the threshold, right? Lower the threshold of fault tolerance so you can get closer and closer. Do you think maybe that has something to do with it? That maybe we lose some of this stuff, some of the flow and some of that transformation because companies just want to give me the agile enough so I can get going. And then I just treat it like a program and bang, I'm off. You think maybe that's some of it? And I know, Troy, you've been to a couple places too. Do they just want to
it definitely.
Yeah,
it definitely seems like the pattern right now. I mean, I think you can see that in a lot of things that we do, not just, I think Troy will love this, but I think you can compare a lot of our agile practices to diets and health, right?
Right.
We don't want to try to figure out what our body responds to or what exercise we need that makes us happy. We'd rather take this program that someone else has found success with and duplicate it exactly. And we want the same results that they got. But that might not fit for us. It might not fit for our lifestyle. It might not fit for our family needs. It might not make us happy.
Right.
So I think the same thing is true with Agile, right? We want the quick fix and the quick solution, and we want that to come in a box with a bow and step-by-step instructions that have a done, a done at the bottom of that list. What do you think, Troy?
I don't know. I'm thinking maybe outside the box on this one, but maybe it's to do with specifically in the U.S., right? Maybe it's to do with the U.S. capitalistic culture, where items like continuous improvement aren't maybe not necessarily seen as good return on investments. Like, that's one. I don't know.
But no, that's a good point because we talked about this. The argument I'm going through now in the whole CapEx versus OpEx monster, right? And figuring out if I'm funding a team, right?
Yeah.
How do I fund that team and keep it a long-lived team with minor interruptions and changes? But how do I also meet the finance needs, right? Because finance is a big part of what we do, whether we like it or not. It's
right.
Uncomfortable. But how do we help them track the CapEx OpEx argument? You're right. So maybe it's not even capitalism. It's as much as it's along those lines. It's how we financially validate the worth, like you said, or ROI. How do we financially validate the worth on what we do? And
right.
maybe we're just there's some old school thinking and a new school, modern problem, and it's not a modern solution. We're going back to the old, generally accepted accounting principles.
Right. But here's the thing, though. I think that if you go with the idea of fit for purpose, this is just an opinion. I could be wrong, but eventually someone else is going to innovate and continuously improve ahead of you. Okay. And when that happens, then you'll either, one or two things is going to happen. You'll just say, well, we do things the way we do it and eventually pay the price. Or you'll have to pay some more consultants to come in and help you improve again. I mean, it's like usually that seems like a pattern. So, instead of kind of, I don't know, there's two approaches to it. The one approach I see is, you pay some people to come in and help you. And then, and if you're serious about it, you stand up like an internal version of it, and you dedicate time and money and resources to it. But I don't necessarily see that everywhere. I think it's seen more or less to some companies as, oh, we'll just hire some people, we'll buy this, they'll come help us, and then for 6 months or 12 months, and then we don't have to do anything internally. We'll be agile. And then meanwhile, it's, a year later, it's like, okay, we're really not where we want to be. So we got to hire some more people. A couple different approaches to it. But like I said, maybe it just comes down to how they view improvement, like the value of it compared to maybe some other cultures. But I'm definitely not an expert in the other cultures. So I think
you also have, the same thing that's true when one organization finds success, finding a practice that's fit for purpose for them. And I think Spotify is a great example of that, right? They took the principles and elements of lean and agile thinking that fit their business and tailored them to their culture and to what they were driving for an output. And now all of us try to replicate it. Everyone's trying to implement the Spotify model and do, all the Spotify's, all of the things that Spotify put in place, because we're trying to replicate their success instead of figuring out what fits for our business.
Not to take us down a rabbit hole, but I'll make sure we put this in the show notes. Did you see that article, Colleen, where someone said that the Spotify model is great and it won't work for your business? And they actually explained the cultural differences between Sweden and the United States, and how, like you said, those models, those mores, those social constructs fit for them, but for our, for lack of a better term, American cowboy development culture, right? The culture of heroes, it doesn't work that way. And we, like you said, we're trying to put a square peg in a round hole.
Right. Yep. Yeah, I actually saw a talk at Agile 2017 by people from Spotify about that exact topic. And why, when people try to replicate it, it doesn't work, and actually how they have iterated on it since they first released it, and things that, they've been improving at since that first kind of model, and how even in New York and in Sweden, how it's different, how the model's a bit different. So, so it kind of goes through your point, Jay. That's good. Okay. So, the question is, why is flow important for an organization? We talked about that, but what does it look like at all levels? So we just talked about business agility. So maybe real quick, we'll touch on, and we're going to get into in a few minutes, the practices and processes maybe we can put in place to try to achieve it. But before we get into the practices, maybe we could talk high level. What does it look like at a portfolio level to have a state of flow? What do you guys think?
So I'll go first, Colleen. When I think of at the portfolio level what the flow looks like, I think of that giant portfolio Kanban board, right? And right now I'm at a safe shop. So obviously we have Agile Central / Rally stood up. Mm-hmm. And I think of how watching those portfolio epics and program epics move across the board. Now, granted, the way you can define how big or how long they are, they may not move as fast. But I also view it as how easily do we absorb a change? So if we have someone who comes back with some market research that says that, hey, I know we planned on doing this product in the fourth quarter, but right now the market's basically screaming for it. Can we absorb it now, and can we reprioritize? And watching that ability and see how painful that is, that's a good arbiter to me as well of flow. If they legitimately can absorb an emergent demand without causing a giant ruckus and months and weeks of replanning meetings and all that other BS we're used to.
Right.
I mean, that's how I think of it.
Oh, Colleen, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the being able to absorb change is a huge piece of this. And I think the other part I think about is making sure that work is ready for the teams to consume. So I feel like a lot of organizations I've worked with at the program and portfolio level, a lot of the product role really ends up being focused on day-to-day managing of work that's in flight, more like project management. And I think one of the things that portfolio level Kanban and bringing visibility into that can help with is shining a bright light on everything that's coming next, so that you can help make decisions along the way about what the next right thing is to pull. So, you're creating options to pick from, and then you're picking just in time when you have a team coming available within that portfolio or inside your program. So I think that part is a huge benefit, and being able to shine that light on all those upstream activities and create some visibility into that piece.
And maybe instead of going through all of the what does it look like at all levels before we get to the practice, maybe we'll just go to the practices for each one as we talk about it. So, Colleen, I know it's something that you teach in your classes, and something that is a great idea is something called Discovery Kanban, right? And you can even do it at the portfolio level. So maybe you can briefly touch on, what Discovery Kanban might look like at a portfolio level.
Yeah, sure. When we talk about Discovery Kanban, it's kind of your innovation funnel. So it's what you're using to vet ideas, which, it's crazy. I think even with all the lean startup work, which feels almost old at this point, like old news. Right. there's still a ton of organizations that don't have any process at all for validating what ideas make it to their teams or to their roadmaps. So the first part of a discovery Kanban is how are you going to validate your ideas and be sure that you're delivering the right things to your users. So think of those like 6th grade science experiments. You're going to come up with a hypothesis and try to understand what problem you're trying to solve. Most organizations don't do that. We start with a solution in mind. We have a great idea of what solution we're going to deliver to the customer, even if it's not what they want.
Right.
So it's backing up from that and saying, what problem are we trying to solve? Going into it with a curious mind. Joshua Kirievsky's done some great work recently on this concept of curiosity and how important it is in an agile mindset. So it's building out your funnel where it becomes, here's all the things that we're going to explore and try to understand the problems for. And if we find that this problem fits a need for our customers, then we might go into a solutioning phase. And so you're basically vetting these options as they get closer to what we call a commitment line. But they can all sit there until you have space available. So I always like to think of this as like remember the more you know PSA.
Right.
We're going to let all of those options sit there until we have a team that's got capacity to pull the next thing. So I'm not going to try to pick what we're going to work on next. There might be something in that bucket that today we think is the best idea, and we've validated that through our discovery Kanban, and today it's the top thing. But tomorrow when we come to work, maybe the guy with did you guys see in the news today the Bitcoin guy that died and they can't?
Oh yeah, and he took 170 million with him. Yeah,
right. Maybe the news has changed what's top priority for our organization tomorrow, and that's gonna drive a different conversation. And so we're not gonna commit to what we're gonna work on next until we have the capacity to pull it. That way we're making a smart decision with the most relevant information at hand when it's time to do that. So your discovery Kanban is just the way you're vetting all those options, and then you let them sit there until it's time to pick.
You were talking about picking the work just in time and let it sit there, let it marinate until it's time to pick the next thing, and then we go towards it. That is I think that ties to back earlier in this conversation, we talked about the whole plan idea and how we create plans that makes people feel more comfortable. And to quote the Joker, nobody worries when everything is going according to plan, even if the plan is horrifying. So that we feel there's almost a false sense of security that, okay, I put all this work in a box and a plan and that's how it's going to happen. And that getting people comfortable with that, yeah, the three of us know all that work that's out there and we have a good idea about what we need to do to solve that problem, but we're not going to commit to it until we actually have to pick something, because then we'll know what the biggest need is. And I think we talked about the problems that organizations have with adopting this and how sometimes the lean thinking gets lost in the way. I think it's that false sense of security with building a plan versus the real life application. We know that you really shouldn't commit until the last minute because then you really pick the right thing. It's that dichotomy that I think a lot of people have problems with.
That's very salient of you, Jay. I think that's the right word. So
probably the smartest thing I've said in 3 weeks. So.
Okay.
No, it is. It's so true. I think, when I teach these classes, I always use the example that I fly constantly, and every time I get to the airport, I call my husband and I start freaking out because my flight's late. And he's like, every time you go to the airport, your flight's late. I don't know why you're always so pissed and why you're so stressed out. Like, they're never on time. This shouldn't be news to you. And it's like, it fucks with my plan, right? That's why I'm mad. I had a plan. I had a plan to get there at a certain time, to get to my room at a certain time. And when somebody takes the control, that control away from you, then you're pissed, or you feel like you don't, you've lost control over what your plan was. And those plans, whether it's, your sprint commitments or your PI planning or roadmap steering, all of these things give us a false sense of control.
And before you go on your rant, Troy, to probably overshare, my wife is waterfall delivery. I'm agile. And here's why. She makes plans on Saturday. We're going to do A, we're going to do B, we're going to do C, we're going to do it in this order. Then we're going to go here. Then we're going to do this with the dogs. Then we're going to do this. As soon as something comes up that throws that into disarray, she freaks out. I hope she can't hear this. She freaks out, right? And she goes crazy. And she looks at me and she goes, how are you so blasé about this? Nothing bothers you. I said, no, it's just, we just have to absorb the change. So that's why I say, well, let's make 1 or 2 plans and keep the rest fluid and we'll see how things go. It drives her bananas that I can absorb the change and be like, I know I said I was going to get that done today. I'll do it tomorrow. And in lieu of that, let's do this. And she's running around screaming, trying to get the project back on track. even though you missed your release date, you're over budget, and things are going downhill.
So so that's a great, Jay, I just, when you said that, I got married last August, and this is, I guess this is too much information, but I got married last August, and when I got married, my dad spoke up, and there's a lot of things I really respect about my dad as far as his things that I wish I was more like, that qualities that he has that I don't have, right? And he pointed out to, like, he kind of got up and said, there's a quality that you have that I wish I had. And I said, what's that? And he said, your ability to just roll and be cool with everything. And I said, what? I was just kind of shocked. I was like, what are you talking about? And he said, whatever happens, you just kind of go with the flow, and you can kind of pivot, and it doesn't throw you in total disarray. And, that seems like, and that when you were just talking about Jay, I said, maybe there's some kind of quality about, like, either agile coaches or agilists, that it's just part of the nature. I don't know, maybe, but that's kind of funny. But yeah, so maybe that's one good trait. I don't know. But yeah, so my thought is, going back to SAFe, and I don't want to make this a SAFe discussion, but let's be honest, in our world, it's pretty prevalent. So I don't think we should ignore it either, right? So SAFe has this concept at a portfolio level of using lean startup type techniques, right? And now that we're talking about Discovery Kanban, the reason I love this concept of Discovery Kanban, actually including it with this lean startup, is because the lean startup thing is like, okay, you have this idea, you have a hypothesis, you define the smallest thing to go test this hypothesis, and then you try to see and you try to validate that before you decide to spend any more money. It's the simplest way I can put it, right? For at a portfolio level. But the Discovery Kanban part is putting more process ahead of that part, right? And actually with the intention of throwing many things out before it even gets there. And I think that's really great. And one of the things I wanted to kind of say, which I love about Discovery Kanban, this whole process is actually, I'm going to take a step back. In SAFe 4.6, they added this 3 horizons strategy from this book called The Alchemy of Growth, which I think is the original book for that. But and it's basically a portfolio budgeting strategy, right? And it ties back into this model, this portfolio Kanban model. And I think what Colleen is saying about Discovery Kanban is really, really perfect for this, because the things that are, if you guys aren't familiar, basically it's like you have your core businesses, you have your emerging businesses, and then you just have your kind of way out in left field innovative things, right? But for every one way out in left field innovative things, you need, for every one idea that you're going to fund an MVP for, maybe you need to have 9 or so that you're going to throw out before you even go and build it, right? Because they are very risky. They are, you want to encourage these types of things. Where your core business, for every one, it probably won't be 9 you throw out, for example, right? So it's just a way of thinking about these things. So there's this, one of the things I've noticed personally, and I'm going to take some lessons from the past from other industries. And in science, a hypothesis is an educated guess. And that means that an educated guess means you have something to go off of before you make the guess, right? Some data, number one, okay? And number 2 is, in science, you actually, part of a hypothesis is you actually try to disprove the hypothesis. So it's not only proving it, but you actually should do things to see if it's going to fail, okay? And not just put metrics in there to try to make it pass, if that makes sense, right? So for an example, I actually said this on the last podcast last week, but this Goodhart's law, which basically states that when a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good metric. Mm-hmm. So it's like, it's essentially, when you have this metric or some kind of leading indicator you're using for this Discovery Kanban, or even for your lean startup at the portfolio level, if you use that as a target, meaning if we're going to try to achieve this before we go build it, then that ceases to become a good metric, because you're going to do things to make that come true. And actually, it could cause a lot of problems, okay? Because then you're biasing yourself.
Confirmation bias. Yeah, you're basically trying to prove yourself right. Yeah.
So the importance of thinking about how could I be wrong every time, right? And the importance of throwing so many things out and many ideas. So this Discovery Kanban process is built in to allow this type of thing to go before we even build any piece of software. So I really think that's it's a fantastic idea.
I want to ask you a question, Colleen, regarding, because you have a lot more experience with Kanban and multiple organizations than I do. The idea of throwing stuff out, how comfortable are most people with that? Because I have seen in my limited experience, regarding if you're doing Kanban or Scrum or whatever, for some reason people end up with this almost paternalistic attachment to certain things, and they're not comfortable with throwing it out. Even though, I mean, you could look at the Kanban board and see this story sitting in the backlog for an amount of time, and they don't want to get rid of it. So do you see a lot of that, and how do you help counter that? Because I think that's a big problem too, is you get backlogs that become almost unmaintainable.
Trash your backlog.
Trash your backlog and no estimates in the same podcast. That might be a little bit too.
Yeah, I know. We're going there. So I think there's a couple things. There's a concept in Kanban of a commitment line, and I think that that's an important factor in getting people to feel more comfortable about the fact that everything that's to the left of that commitment line is garbage. Really, we don't care. I consider that the dumping ground. Everybody wants that dumping ground because they want to make sure that their notes get recorded and filed away somewhere, but it is a trash can. So, I feel like one of the things that can be interesting to track is how long things have been in that backlog that have never made it across that commitment line. They probably never will, especially for teams that have a lot of unplanned work that comes up. Things tend to go straight to that to-do column and never sit in the backlog. So I think, again, data is your best friend in this instance. When you can start to have a conversation about how old things are in that backlog, maybe anything that's more than a month old, you automatically delete. Because chances are you're never going to get to it. And backlogs, I think Melissa Perry said this in one of her interviews with us, that, we just keep adding more and more shit to those backlogs and we never take anything out.
Right.
Yep.
And that's, it's true regardless of what process or practices you're using from an agile perspective. I think the key here is what's most important to us is work that we've committed to doing, and we want to keep a low WIP limit on that to-do column so that we're focusing on the highest priority work. So to me, anything to the left of that is, we'll document it so that you feel better. But I'm not concerned with prioritizing that. And I try to get away from using even language of backlogs when I'm switching teams or teaching teams Kanban. I call it the options queue. Because I think that the notion of backlog immediately means this list of stuff we're picking from the top of that is prioritized and that we are planning to do. Whereas if you can just switch the language slightly to being an options queue, I think it just changes the way you think about it, right? It is just a bucket. Tomorrow I might pick the thing at the bottom that's 6 months old. But we won't know until we have capacity to have that conversation.
So in Heinrich Naberg's book, Lean from the Trenches, his teams that he was working with, they had like this number. Now, I'm not suggesting using this exact number, but the story goes that their number was 30. So they never allowed more than 30 items in a backlog. So basically, if you wanted to get on a backlog, it had to be within the top 30. Okay. So it's like, if it's not within the top, so if it is, something else gets removed. That was like this, they had a lot of success with that. So I'm not suggesting that 30, every team should use that number 30. It's context dependent. But the idea of saying this backlog is not going to just keep growing forever. We're going to, cut it off at some point. That makes sense. I think that was pretty cool.
I think if we go back to the concept of eliminating waste in our system, right? And David Anderson's done some recent talks and speaking about this concept that if that's our core tenet, that we're trying to remove waste from our process, when we think about how much time we spend grooming shit in the backlog and prioritizing that backlog and jockeying for position number 29 or 30 or 31, right? And having conversations with stakeholders about that. That's a lot of time and energy spent on work we may not do. And so there's also the argument that even managing your backlog to that extent is wasted effort.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So program level, What does it look like, flow, and what are some practices and processes we can put in place? I'll take this one if you guys don't mind. I'll start it off. So flow at a program level. So it really depends on the context, I think, here. If you're using some kind of scaling framework where you have multiple teams working on features. So for instance, like one team or an epic, depending on what you're calling them, but basically one team or multiple teams working on the same product or feature or epic, then, usually you use some kind of scaling technique, right, for that. And so for that, I think a program level works fantastic, but it doesn't, you don't have to be used as scaling technique. You can use it really for any program. But the important thing is to stand up a real Kanban board at the program level and track all of your work going through that at that program level, and you use flow metrics. So for example, if you are using some kind of scaled framework, and again, we keep talking about safe. It doesn't have to be safe, but for an example, safe, if you have your features, at that level, you'd want to track flow of the features, because what's happening at that feature level is going to impact your flow at the portfolio level. Mm-hmm. And even more importantly, what's happening at the team level is going to impact the program level, which is going to impact the portfolio level. But tracking at all three levels gives you different views, and usually there's this different set of problems, which could be the bottlenecks, right? Now, you can always say, oh, we can track it back to the team and something like that, but a lot of times there's things that are outside of the team's control that are going to be causing the bottlenecks, and that might be architectural decisions that might be just, hey, we can't deliver software because or we can't release the software in some capacity because of the way we currently release software, and that has to be changed.
Right.
It doesn't mean
theory of constraints type stuff. Where's the one bottleneck? How do I find it? Remove it if it is a bad constraint. Yeah.
Right. And that might not be the team's. That might be totally out of team's control at some of these decisions. So that's why tracking it at a portfolio level and then at program level. So one of the things that at my current client we do, which is pretty awesome, is that at least once a week, basically all the POs and Scrum Masters and some managers and get around this program Kanban board and we walk it right to left. And we talk about, okay, here are the metrics for this week. Here's our cycle time. Here's our WIP. And here's our average. I even help them, and I even manually put up their average arrival and departure rates, things like that. And then we talk about, okay, so how do we get things out the door? How do we stop starting, start finishing? These types of questions. And there's no status updates. It's literally just people talking about who needs help getting things out the door. When is this going to happen? And how do we get better at this? And then you use that for, and you'll start to see clustering of issues typically. So you'll see, okay, I have this issue and this is why I can't get it over to the next column or whatever. So if you start clustering them, then you can use that as kind of like improvement roadmaps too. So the the program Kanban can be very powerful because it really reveals where your system is slowing down, where the bottlenecks are, and it takes it so much. It really takes it away from what I like about it is it's not so much focusing in on the teams itself, but it's more focusing about how do we, as management or as leaders, enable the teams to have better flow at the team level. What things do we have to change? And I think the program Kanban typically can help facilitate those conversations. What do you guys think in your experience?
You're on mute.
I think one of the things when I think of the program Kanban that I think can be a pretty powerful tool is setting the success metrics for the epics and keeping those on the board so that you're creating that feedback loop. And that's one of the things, even just thinking about discovery Kanban at the epic or initiative level, I think it can still be very, I guess, gut instinct driven, which things we pick next from our options bucket, whether that's whether that's at the story level or epic or initiative level. But when we create some visibility into the success metrics for those individual epics and can track that on our program level boards, then we actually have some data from how things are doing once we've released them out into the wild that can help us make decisions about what to select next. So it's really closing that feedback loop and then using the data from how things are performing to help you pick what you're going to work on next. And I feel like in the organizations that I've worked with that have done that well, it really levels the playing field from a prioritization standpoint. So you get away from HIPPO, right? From the highest paid person's opinion, driving that conversation, or from the, maybe the loudest or angriest customer driving that prioritization conversation, or just, your strongest product manager driving that conversation. And it becomes more about the data of how things are performing. And I really like to start to capture that at that program level board, so that you can have that conversation, okay, we've got a team coming available. What epic do we want to pull next? And is any of the metrics that we're gathering on what we've deployed, will they help us make the decision about what that should be?
Yeah. Jay, you got anything?
Well, I think Colleen brings up a great point with the idea of the definition of done / success / acceptance criteria, right? Because that is a good indicator of, we talked about batch size. If you have an epic or a feature that has a laundry list of success criteria, well, it's either too big, or it's too big and you don't know it, or you're shooting for the moon. You're not really thinking in concept of minimum viable, product, potentially shippable increment, whatever. I think that is a huge part of it, is looking at that piece and saying, okay, we got to keep that in mind. And teams that do that well, they will, I think, almost organically end up with flow through their program at that level, because they're defining the work and saying, okay, I always go back to that definition someone said of, it's how your acceptance criteria should be how to move. It's okay to move on to the next item. And that always rattles around in my head, because if you have that defined very well, you're going to build flow. Not only will you build flow into the system organically, you're also going to be able to recognize very, very fast when something is too big, because
I like that.
Real quickly you'll choke on it.
Right. So awesome. So team level, what does it look like? What are the practices? So I'll start with this one. So the obvious thing is, okay, well, we have Kanban teams, so they should be using flow metrics and whip limits and these types of things. Obviously, I keep saying obviously, but in my experience, that doesn't always happen. So I think that's another podcast idea, is to talk about, are we actually even doing Kanban at all? That's one thing. But going from there, I don't think it matters what framework you're using. You can apply lean thinking to any framework. And just the principles of building quality of reducing your WIP, right? Even if you're not even technically using flow metrics, let's say you're not using flow metrics, you're a regular Scrum team. Hey, let's just take a look at our WIP, right? Let's try to do things to build quality instead of, and reduce our handoffs instead of throwing things over a wall, even in a sprint, right? So just some of those principles can really help a team. Now, some of the best teams I've worked with and I've seen come from a Scrum background. And one of the things about, I think, a good Scrum team is they're cross-functional and they're very collaborative. So if you have a team that's already that way, you start to introduce some of these concepts to them, they kind of latch onto it very quickly, because they say, okay, we like working together. So working together and having more conversations about building in quality and sharing more responsibility, which sometimes tends to be very beneficial in when you reduce your WIP, that can lend itself if you have a really high performing Scrum team before you introduce these concepts. I don't think there's one right way to do these things as far as what should come first. It doesn't really matter. It's totally context dependent. But I would say practices like reducing WIP, and maybe it's not, if you're on a Scrum team and you're not using Kanban columns, if you just have a general in progress, maybe you just start with saying, well, we're going to limit the amount of stories we have in progress. Simple as that, right? And then we'll go from there, Another thing I like doing with teams is talking about how do we left shift our quality, and how do we build quality from the beginning. And a lot of times that starts before anybody even writes any code at all, So it might be using processes like behavior-driven development, like the Three Amigos process, right? And having really effective in Scrum, we have this backlog refinement or sprint planning, and we talk about testing and we talk about our scenarios and things like that, and kind of get everyone on the team thinking about these things instead of just one person who's going to go in a silo and write some stuff and then hand it off to somebody else, So that's just some things. And obviously the last thing I would say is some XP practices, like pair programming, like test-driven development that are going to build the quality in, and also reduce your bottlenecks most likely. And continuous integration, which if you think about continuous integration as it was created, it seems to me like very similar to a lean, like a manufacturing situation where when you're building in the quality in so early that every time the build is broken, everyone should stop what they're doing and go fix it, right? Before we create more quality problems. So it kind of comes back to the encore way of working. So I've ranted a little bit about this. So what do you guys think at a team level? What does it look like? What are the practices?
I think you touched on a lot of the core practices, and making policies explicit. What does it mean if it's in code review? What does it mean? What does each stage of our process mean? I think one of the things that I really love about Kanban is I think it makes the developers take a lot more ownership over their process. And I say developers, recently I feel like I've done more Kanban work with security teams and IT ops teams. So regardless of what the team's doing, I think Kanban gives the team a lot more ownership over their process and control over it. And I feel like a lot of teams that I've worked with will start working and we'll set some WIP limits, and then they're like, these WIP limits suck, or they're too high, or they're too low, and everybody's panicking. And I'm like, well, then change them. You guys have the ability to change them. And so I like that the whole model for flow at the team level also empowers them to do a lot of experimentation. If the team tells me they want to double their WIP limit, I will let them. But I usually say, what do you expect that to do? What do we expect to see? Do you think you're going to get more done? Do you think it's going to cut cycle time down? And by how much? Let's write it as an experiment and let's do it for 2 weeks and see what happens. And, if you're right that we double our output and cut our cycle time in half, then I'll eat crow and we'll keep our WIP limit at double this amount. Chances are we won't. So,
yeah.
But I like that sense of empowerment that this gives the teams to be able to play with their process. And that's not just WIP limits, right? That's what does our board look like? What does our workflow look like? What are the policies for how things move from one state to the next? And that's really just telling the team, like, I'm not your babysitter. I'm not here to carry the big stick and yell.
When you talk about team level, right, and what are the processes we can put into place, I'll give you a real life example. The last team I actually ran, I was as a Scrum Master. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to give you a nice, healthy segue here. I stole something from Hrcsko's book on no estimates, where I let the teams do their refinement, and they started sizing their stories. And then it got to a point where I went into a refinement session. I said, okay, no more fives. No more fives. Right. Everything is a 1, 2, or 3.
Right.
Okay, and then we did that. And then eventually it was, okay, well, no more 3s. Everything is a 1 or a 2. And they all hated me for it. They absolutely hated me for it. But it eventually got to a point, back to my first point about batch size. They were consistent with getting the work of the same size chunk. So they couldn't help but get stuff flowing through the system because all the work was of equal small size. So they were churning through it at a better rate. So it wasn't me, I didn't have to preach WIP, which I did, and, cumulative flow diagrams and all that stuff. I basically kept banging on the drum of make sure all of your work is of the same size. And it did end up with some positives, surprisingly.
Right.
Really, really impressed that it actually worked. But it was a lot of hooting and hollering. Oh, with this, I need a 3, blah, 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 blah. I want to do 5. No.
That's cool, man. Is Colleen back?
I see her in the video, but I think she froze again. So let's keep going.
Okay. Yeah. So piggybacking off of what you were saying, Jay, have you ever seen the Lunar Logic estimation cards?
No.
All right, I'm gonna show you. I mean, I'll link them in the show notes, and then I'll just describe what it is. I'm gonna put it in the Slack channel. So this is a technique that I've used to start to introduce the concept of no estimates to a team who's used to estimating. Okay. So kind of like what you were just saying, basically. But these cards are really fun. So, and they have a cursing version and a non-cursing version, a profane version and a non-profane version. Okay. So the profane version, I'm not going to say it, but basically every card. So basically the way it works is the Lunar Logic planning poker has 3 different cards. One of the cards is a 1. The next card is TFD, which stands for 2F and big, right? And the next card is NFC, which stands for no effing clue. So when you're planning poker,
same idea, same concept, yeah.
It's either a 1, it's too big, or I don't know enough about this to even estimate it. So we got to talk about it, right? We got to figure it out. And that's just kind of a way to to go. And I think the non-profane version is like too frighteningly big or something like that.
Okay. The cop out, yeah.
Yeah. So they have different ones like you can buy. So I have like 4 sets of these. So I carry around with me. But yeah, that gets to the thought about no estimates, which is obviously to some folks is kind of controversial. But I think at a team level, I think teams kind of latch onto it if you can do it well, because do you mean I don't have to sit there and think about if something's a 5 or an 8 and then be held to that, So I think it's kind of appealing at that level, but it's actually more powerful at a company level, because now you're not dealing with, and when we say no estimates, we're really talking about probabilistic forecasting, right? And I can give an example of that, but before I do, the advantage is it gives you the power to say, this will be done on this date with a probability of X% based off of real data and nobody's guess, right? So it's like if someone high up, so you have an account owner, right? If you have a stakeholder and they say, when is my feature that I'm paying for, whatever, or my epic, when is it likely to be done? You don't have to sit there and do a bunch of voodoo math. You don't have to use Fibonacci sequences and really do all these things.
Honestly, Troy, how much effort do we put into teaching people Fibonacci sequences and relative sizing, right? Which think about it, Colleen. Think about all the time we waste, and especially when we talk, let's go back to the business agility mark, right? Like you're taking people who don't have anything to do with software development. You're making them a product owner, and you're telling them you can't use 4. What do you mean I can't use 4? Well, it's either a 1, 2, or 3, or a 5. Well, what's between 3 and 5? Well, you can't. It's either a 3 or a 4. It's either a 3 or 5. There is no between. It's insane. Like, talk about maximizing the stupid work we do. Ugh.
Right. Yeah. So probabilistic forecasting is basically taking all of your data points and using some math. But the good thing is that the tools do the math for you, so you don't have to do it. And the tools can be something like an Excel sheet. And like Troy McGinnis has these free Excel sheets he gives out for these things on his website, Focus Objective. Or you can use a tool. So Dan Vacanti has a tool that I've used, which is awesome, called Actionable Agile Metrics, that's the name of the book, but I think the tool is called something like that, right? Actionable Agile Metrics, yeah, I think that's the name of the tool. So, and they have a Jira plugin, they have a standalone version, so you have some options there. The point is that I'm going to give an example as to, and Colleen has heard me say this, but I don't think the audience has. So if you were to, okay, let's put it this way. If your boss said Monday morning, Jay, I'll use you as an example. Jay, at Monday morning, you have to arrive at work at 9 o'clock. And if you don't arrive at work at 9 o'clock for this biggest meeting of the company's life, which we're really depending on you to be there, you're going to lose your job or whatever. Some dramatic thing's going to happen, right? So you have to be there at 9 o'clock, right? So then it's like, okay, well, how do you go about determining how long you'll need to get to work? Just a question. So my first question to you, Jay, is would you look at, so let's say you leave your house at 8 a.m., right? And on average, you leave at 8 a.m. and on average, it takes you 45 minutes to get to work. So on average, you get there at 8:45, right? Would you use a 45-minute average on that Monday to go to work?
No.
General question.
Nope.
All right. So why not?
Because there are too many things that can go wrong. There are too many unknowns. So if you're telling me I need to be to work at 9 a.m. and my career and life depend on it,
right.
I'm leaving the house at like 6 or 7. I would rather get there and just suck down coffee and actually get myself fired from talking too fast in a meeting than take the chance of not showing up at 9 a.m.
Right. So essentially what we do when I say we, I mean as Agilists, but in general in the industry, it seems like most people take an average of voodoo math, right? And then they forecast that average as to when things will be done. So one thing, you're taking math numbers that aren't real in the first place, and then you're adding them up, and then you're averaging them. And then we're saying, yes, please pay X amount of dollars per sprint for this team, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And over the course of a couple of years, it's going to be millions of dollars probably, right? But we're still going to use averages to forecast, right? So it's like not important enough to not use real data to give a forecast. But yet, if we had to do it individually to get to work, we wouldn't use averages. So probabilistic forecasting is getting away from using averages and actually forecasting based off of probabilities. So what you could do if you were using a tool, Jay, to get to work, right? If the tool was tracking all of your drives to work, for example, right? or train trips or whatever. So what you would do is you would plot out every single day you've ever went to work, for example, and when, and how long it took you every day. And then it would give you a graph, and it would show you on one axis, on a y-axis, right, you would have from the shortest amount of time it took you to the longest. And then on the x-axis, it would just have dates, going, right, from beginning to end. And then what you would do is you would see a bunch of dots. They would look like stars in the sky, maybe. That's one way I kind of look at it. And when you look at that, you'd say, okay, well, 95% of the time, 95% of these dots are below a certain line, right? So for you, it might be 95% of the time I arrive at work in an hour and 20 minutes. It takes me, right, for an example. But yet on average, I get to work in 45 minutes. So if you were to plan out to get there, maybe you'd be okay with 95%, or maybe you'd want to go with 100% in that scenario, which might be some outlier because there was a hurricane. Okay.
Right. That's the whole, the Vacanti scatter plot thing that's in actual isometrics, where you look at where things bulk up, and that's how you,
Correct. So if you said, hey, like the one outlier, which is not giving me 100%, right? Or which is kind of skewing the 95% is there was a hurricane that one day, right? So it's like you look at this saying, okay, there's probably not going to be a hurricane. The weather looks good. Okay, maybe I'll go with that 95%. And you'll plan out an hour and 20 minutes based off probability and not off. And that is using real data and no guessing and no estimating. That's where the term no estimates comes from. So you can apply this at a team level, at a program level, at a portfolio level, and use time, real dates, real discussions, not story points or unicorn points or fairies or leprechaun points. Okay.
Right.
So I don't have a problem with story points. I mean, I think they work well at a team level when it comes to getting everyone in the room talking about how big something is and maybe it needs to be broken down. For those types of things, it's fine, but I don't think it's totally needed either, and it can be helpful for a lot of teams. But for forecasting, I think it's totally
more harm than good. More harm than good. And let's be honest here, Troy. So some of the things you bring up, it takes a truly mature team to get to this whole no estimates point. Like it does. It takes a team who's done their reps, taken their beatings, and has gotten comfortable with how they work as a team. But I as an almost aside, I think the reason why the term no estimates gets people so enraged, right, or up in arms. If you follow the discussion on Twitter, which is always exciting, a bunch of adults yelling at each other on a social media platform, the people that get the maddest about no estimates are people that you can tell have either not read the book or not listened to anything Hrcsko talks about in the book. They just see no estimates. They think, how can you build software without giving an estimate? And they rumble. They make the South Park noise. Where when you read the book, like you said, you're not giving estimates. You're giving basically what I call, you're giving prognostications grounded in fact. You're giving data-driven decisions based upon what you know. And that, but the whole idea of, oh, no estimates, we can't just write code without an estimate. Blah, blah, blah. Right, Colleen? I'm sure you said the same thing.
Oh, yeah. No, you're totally right. You know, it's making me laugh because it is. It's fair. Same thing with the concept of not planning, right? You have to have a plan. I think you got some guff from that recently, Troy, of somebody freaking out about how you can't deliver anything if you don't do planning.
Yeah. So we had that episode, shipping over planning, and nowhere in that episode did I or anyone ever say that you should not plan. That never happened, but apparently
I'll say it today.
Okay. So
planning.
Yes. Anyway, so one last thing I'll say about probabilistic forecasting is there's this technique, and it's a tool. And it's usually built into Vacanti's tool, but there's other tools you can use in it, like I said, Excel sheets. It's called a Monte Carlo forecast, and it comes from statistics, I believe, and we're just kind of borrowing it really in the Agile world here. But it's what you do is you put all your data in this tool, and then it does simulations. So I think Vacanti's tool does by default 10,000 simulations. So it'll simulate 10,000 different scenarios based off of all your real data, and then tell you. So if you wanted to say, okay, by Christmas, right, this year, how many items will be done? So let's say we're using stories, right? And you can even use it at a team level program, doesn't really matter. And you could say, okay, based off of all the real data, 326 stories will be done, right? And it's like, oh wow, I don't even have to guess that. That's off the real data. That's pretty powerful. Right. Or you can say, okay, so we have a couple features left, right? And there's roughly 100 stories in these features. So when will these 100 stories be done based off of real data? And then it'll give you a date. So you can do it either way, And then you can even go in and say, okay, 10,000 simulations isn't enough. I need 1 million. And you hit a button and it gives you 1 million. It really doesn't. It kind of gets ridiculous after a while, but ultimately, there are techniques and tools out there which, in my opinion, and I would imagine some other people on this call, are more realistic and I would even say superior than using a Fibonacci sequence to do forecasting. So that's my opinion and thoughts on it. Anything else from you guys about no estimates or probabilistic forecasting?
Colleen?
I think that's everything. I think we covered a good round here, guys.
Yeah, I think we've beaten the snot out of it, and obviously, like most of our episodes, we could easily do another 3 hours on just takeaway remarks that were made throughout the podcast. But I think we hit what we were trying to hit.
Great, guys. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything you guys would like to promote, or anywhere somebody could reach you at?
You can find me on Twitter at ScrumHive, ironically enough, after this whole conversation. Somebody asked me recently if that was a joke. And then we are launching a Kanban bootcamp program, a Kanban team launch program, and you can find out more information about that at craftedkanban.com.
Awesome. And Jay, what about you?
As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Backdoor Agile. And you can also find me bouncing around the coalition. We've had a couple of good conversations going on there, and I have nothing else to promote except for our knock on wood, our upcoming scaling deep dive on the scaling frameworks. I keep trying to will that thing into existence. It's my pet project, but look for that closer to the early second quarter.
Awesome. And you can reach me on Twitter at G4STroy, TROI, @gmail.com, and on my brand new website, cookingandketones.com. It's a side note, but I know, but I'm all into this stuff. So if you want some cool recipes or a pretty interesting blog, which is not Agile related, but you might find it fascinating, you can check that out. So that's what I had to promote. But I'm looking forward to the next Agile Uprising podcast, either being on it or listening, because I really enjoy all the topics you guys discuss when I'm not on there. It's makes the commute to work much easier. So, all right. So thank you so much, and we're out.